From the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, this is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity.
Being alone is not the state for which human beings are created. We are social, profoundly social, more broadly also political kinds of animals. And in that sense, it's not good for us to be alone. It's not us to be alone. We are who we are in community with others. And maybe we sense something about what is necessary for us in the process of becoming human. Nobody can be born in my place. I must be born. This is, in a sense, this is a solitary experience. Nobody can die in my place. I have to take that responsibility, or it happens to me. Somebody can help me in this, but it's happening to me as an individual. I think nobody can lead my life between birth and death in my place. I must do it. And in this specifically individual responsibility that I have to kind of stabilize myself so that I know how to be myself in relationship with other people. And I think solitude is really important for that, because otherwise we can get lost in the crowd. You can put it this way. When I am in solitude, I have relationship to God through my relationship to myself. When I'm with others, I have relationship with God through my relationship with them. When I am with the environment, when I'm with the animals, I have relationship to God in my relationship to them.
I'm Macie Bridge with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and this is Solo, a series on solitude, loneliness, and being alone. There's something dreamy and courageous about the ways we speak about living or adventuring on one's own. Young adults long for the day they can move out of their parents' house, take on a new city, and get their own place. We see it in novelty stories all the time. Young, independent woman renovates van and travels country full-time. Or undaunted athlete scales this life-threatening climb or previously untraversed distance. There's practically a whole category of Guinness World Records for things accomplished alone. When someone enters a new chapter alone, whether by choice or because of the hand life has dealt them, we encourage them with enthusiasm for starting a fresh new chapter. A chance to redesign their life how they, and only they, want to live it. Indeed, there seems to be something essentially good about the ways we get to know ourselves, our needs, wants, hopes, and dreams when we are alone. And yet, running parallel to the self-reliance, esteem, and rugged individualism our culture praises is the epidemic of loneliness. It hits our elderly populations, our young people, and our working professionals. Our world is full of lonely people. And we describe this problem with the same descriptors we'd use to describe life-threatening disease. We are relational creatures. And as Christians, there's a basis for relationality baked into our call to discipleship. So what gives? How are we supposed to think Christianly about solitude, loneliness, and being alone? Well, here are a few brief moments from each of my guests in this series to give you a sense for what's to come.
It's like the symptom that desires its cure. Loneliness, disconnected from longing, disconnected from desire, is a really dangerous thing. But I think, at least with ecological loneliness, there are these ways to become reconnected. And there are ways, even very simple ones, that like individuals can do to make the landscape just around them more hospitable.
The disciplines of solitude and silence have always been challenging for people, but wondering if in these days, in our times, as we are being formed by these technologies, we are unaccustomed to God's silence or God's stillness, right? Because we are a people on the move, always getting content, always getting some kind of feedback from someone immediately, right? And so what happens then with our interior spirituality, like the shape of our souls?
Marjorie frames herself as a figure who is constantly looking for connection, sometimes finding it, but sometimes it being rejected in really painful ways, and whose sort of imaginings are often about finding this sort of spiritual community she's not managing to find on earth. For someone who insisted on keeping within the world, she wants to remain married, she's still a mother, she's still going on pilgrimage, visiting people. So many of the book is her conversations with other people. But there's a really strong sense throughout of her feeling isolated, but it's hard not to read the text and feel her loneliness.
In my current clinical life, I have large numbers of patients that we refer to as unrepresented. The old language for this was unbefriended, who are sick and unable to make decisions for themselves. And these unrepresented patients have no one. They have no family member, no adult children, no neighbor, no one in their lives who can help guide their medical decision-making. And the number of patients I've cared for here in New York for whom that is true is an extraordinary number.
To kick off Solo, my series on solitude, loneliness, and being alone, I'm speaking first with the center's own Miroslav Volf. Miroslav's thinking about what he calls aloneness, loneliness, and solitude foregrounded much of my thinking in the curation of these interviews. I'm thrilled for you to venture with us today into his previously unshared theology of aloneness, how this differs from a practice of solitude, humanity's need for relationship, and what we may learn of God when we go to God alone. Thanks for listening today. Miroslav, it is always good to be with you, but especially good to be with you on the podcast today. Thank you for making time for this.
I'm delighted.
So the idea for this series in the first place started because a little birdie told me that you had done some thinking a number of years ago on some ideas of solitude and loneliness. So those were particularly poignant in our moment with the pandemic. And those are themes that I'd been thinking on in my own life. And now it's kind of blossomed into this whole series on the podcast. And I'm grateful to have you offering to our listeners these initial ideas that started your thinking on it and which have inspired some of my thinking with our other guests on these ideas. So the big, giant questions that I'm hoping we can get to today are thinking around what the place of solitude is to a flourishing life and what our responsibility to our own loneliness or to the loneliness of others should be, or maybe as we experience it now, how we can change that. Those are the biggest questions we could tackle. But before we get there, I'm hoping that you might introduce us first to how you define loneliness, or I believe you've used the term aloneness, and how you differentiate it from solitude.
Yeah, I have been thinking off and on about solitude and about loneliness, about aloneness. The COVID pandemic obviously accentuated this in experiences of many. I myself was not afflicted during COVID. I ended up coming to my office from where we are now recording this, and there was nobody in the whole building. And I was just perfectly fine to work. Though I love being with other people, I wasn't troubled by spending days alone. So maybe the introvert me kind of kicked into gear, and I was enjoying simply working. And even that description, a bit, I could be alone for hours and not feel lonely. And loneliness I take to be a sense that I miss the contact with the other. I have been in myself kind of diminished, even emotionally rattled, because I don't have anybody around. I don't have these affirming glance. I don't have a smile. I don't have somebody else there present with me in my life. And that's how I tend to think of loneliness. And there were times when I was lonely, not during these hours, during COVID. And solitude, on the other hand, would probably be how I would describe those times. Solitude here in my particular case was solitude to attend to what I thought was really a task that I had before me, undisturbed by other interactions. I was there to devote myself to it. Solitude can be for some particular task, but solitude can also be significant for my work on myself, my own coming back to myself, being at one with myself, and in that oneness with myself, finding strength and new perspective for living with others or engaging my tasks.
Mm-hmm. In some of your writing on this idea that you shared with me, you wrote a little bit about Adam and Eve and the creation story. Do you understand an experience of loneliness or having a sense of aloneness as fundamental to our humanity on some level?
Adam's story is quite an interesting one. I think it comes to us in the process of the second account of creation, which means Adam wasn't finished yet, or the paradise wasn't finished yet. This was still as things were in the process of being created. And there we also see something about the features of our humanity. A good friend of mine by the name of Sedlacek, the economist from Czech Republic, he's written quite a bit about biblical stories and how they intersect with our economic imagination. And one of the things that he says, first emotion recorded in the Bible is that of loneliness. Adam was lonely. And I'm not sure whether it's right that it's the first emotion recorded when God says it is not good for human being to be alone. It means the world hasn't been created yet. But there's a kind of indication here that being alone is not the state for which human beings are created. We are social, profoundly social. More broadly, also, therefore, also political kinds of animals. And in that sense, it's not good for us to be alone. It's not us to be alone. We are who we are in community with others. And maybe we sense something about what is necessary for us in the process of becoming human. I'm thinking, for instance, of a newborn. You can feed a newborn, right? But if the newborn does not have touch, if the newborn doesn't have a look into their eyes, if there's no smell of another person, if a newborn cannot be held closely, the newborn will not develop.
Will not thrive.
Will not thrive, will not be what that young little person was supposed to be. In that sense, it's clear that presence of others are just constitutive to who we as human beings are. In that sense, it's not good, in almost like a metaphysical sense. It's not good for us to be alone. We aren't ourselves when we are simply alone. And I think then when we, in certain kinds of situations, when we are alone and feel that other people are missing, a certain sense of loneliness can come to be.
So then that leads me right into this very large question of, then what is the place of solitude in a flourishing Christian life? If we understand relationship as so fundamental also to the flourishing life.
Yeah, so in a sense, you can say we live in this dynamic relationship over time, a time of togetherness with other people, time being alone by ourselves. Sometimes togetherness with other people feels like a penalty. You don't want to be with other people. There are too many of other people, wrong kinds of other people. So our sociality has to be, so to speak, managed. It has to fit our own measure at any given time. I think the same is true also for our aloneness. That too has to be measured. It can be very damaging for us when we don't have a touch that leads us into life, when we don't have a recognition of another that we are, when we are completely left cut off other people, when we have a sense maybe that we are worthless. We are nobodies. Nobody cares for me. Nobody wants to see me. I am completely left alone. And almost like imagine I'm last human on the planet. That would be a kind of sense that some people might have because they feel simply completely bereft of relationship. Now, the different kind of aloneness, which one can describe as solitude, is aloneness which is also constitutive of me, and which I need to properly come to myself and be in touch with who I am as myself. And you see, for instance, in the life of Jesus, that he takes time away from the crowds, away from his disciples, and he spends time in prayer. That's solitude. That's solitude that brings one back in touch with who one is. And I think it reflects something that's really fundamental to us. There are things in which other people cannot be my substitutes, in which other people cannot function as in my place, which I cannot lean on them. Nobody can be born in my place. I must be born. Nobody can die in my place. I have to take that responsibility, or it happens to me. Somebody can help me in this, but it's happening to me as an individual. I think nobody can lead my life between birth and death in my place. I must do it. And in this specifically individual responsibility that I have to kind of stabilize myself so that I know how to be myself in relationship with other people. And I think solitude is really important for that, because otherwise we can get lost in the crowd, for instance. We can get lost in the friendship. And sometimes it's simply seeking to merge with the crowd, and we become echoes, mere echoes of the crowd, or mere echoes of the relationship which we are so close. Sometimes it can be the crowd has invaded us. It's invaded our psyche. And no matter what we do, we just hear this, sometimes not being able to recognize what's me, what's somebody else. The same is true in individual relationships, sometimes even in bad friendships. Bad religion will do that to you. Bad marriage will do that to you. Bad friendships and so forth. And in those kinds of situations, and more broadly, even when that's not the case, we need a place where we could stand by ourselves, see ourselves as we are seen by others, think about our identity, come back to ourselves so that we don't end up in all the exchanges that we have with others kind of lost. We don't lose ourselves to ourselves. We're lost. We're not who we are. And suddenly we find ourselves, well, what has become of me?
Before we share the rest of today's episode, here's what's coming up next time in our limited series, Solo.
I had the luxury of being close to these marshlands where I could just get knee deep in marsh mud and look at all the crabs and the birds and things coming through. I think that kind of proximity combined with my dad's nudging to notice and to name also. I think names can be kind of important, not for some kind of exact classification or memorization, but the name of a plant or an animal can be the beginning of that creature's story, their life history.
Glad you're with us. Now back to the episode. When we do have these feelings of loneliness, as I think that in many ways, people may encounter acute loneliness when they're circumstantially in situations of solitude, but perhaps don't have a strong sense of self or a strong sense of seeking self in God, as you're kind of naming as a positive of an experience of solitude. As Christians, I think I worry about a danger in suspecting that an experience of loneliness is a fault of relationship with God. I think that there's a line of thinking that might suggest that to grapple with feelings of loneliness, we are not seeking relationship with God well enough, or that that's a fault in our faith.
Yeah, that is often the case. More and more kind of pious circles, one can sense that. I remember also talking to my mother. She would often think that as if somehow God is not enough, and she needs something in addition, but God, say by definition, should be enough.
Right.
And God isn't enough. I think, in a sense, that what this kind of attitude forgets is that we are social and material beings, which is to say that we live as part of environments that we cannot, and even our relationship to God cannot be extracted from the relationship in which we are, so that you could have this pure relationship with God that should be enough, and then you have other relationships. It seems to me that very often relationship to God come to us are mediated by relationship to others. And so it's not that I am with God in solitude, but I am away from God when I am with others. Both in solitude and with others, I, in many ways, can be seen as being with God. And I think this kind of idea that even when I'm with others, I am there before God and with God. It's interesting what Dietrich Bonhoeffer says when he discusses the creation of a woman who ends up being named Eve later on. And he says that the other human being for us is a limit, which I think is a very interesting concept, because other human being occupies space, is in time. And to me, that other human being is a limit that I cannot and ought not transgress. And you can see already in that giving of the limit, the giving of another human being as a limit in the account of creation, there is a sense that already there, in relationship to that other, I am in relationship to God, honoring other. I do honor God. At the same time, dishonoring other, I dishonor God at the same time. And this kind of sense that other is demanding of me, this respect for the limit, is a mode in which I engage, in which I am spiritual. Because I honor this space, I have to withdraw. I cannot transgress it. The moment I transgress it, the moment I do not honor and love that other person, they become negative limit for me. They're that against which, under whatever circumstances, my freedom bumps. And when my freedom bumps at them as an undesirable limit, I end up not just indifferent to them often, I end up hating them. And this kind of proximity then can be, for me in those cases, it can be a sense of a kind of loss of my own calling to my own life. So all this to say is that having another person as my companion, living together with others, is a mode of expressing my creaturehood and my responsibility to others, to love them and to honor them. And in that, I recognize who I am before God. I am one of the many creatures that God had made, and this is part and parcel of my relationship to God. So I have relationship with God in relationship with others, but I have relationship with God also in my relationship myself before God. You can put it this way. When I am in solitude, I have relationship to God through my relationship to myself. When I'm with others, I have relationship with God through my relationship with them. When I am with the environment, when I'm with the animals, I have relationship to God in my relationship to them. Bonhoeffer is very interesting on this, by the way. And you find that in that text in Genesis 2, because he talks about God first bringing animals to Adam, and to figure out, as a response to the problem, Adam was alone, whether Adam would recognize himself. And so rather than dismissing animals as sometimes, those are just inadequate, now the woman is created, now everything's good. Bonhoeffer rather thinks, no, they're also companions. There are worldly creatures. They're companions, but they're just not fully adequate companion for it. But they too are a limit, right? So it's a kind of world of limits in which I exist. And sometimes in solitude, I reflect before God on myself in the environment with the others. What is it that's happening to me in relationship to others? What is it that I'm doing to others in relationship with them? And that's how spirituality is nurtured in this time alone. And yet in this time alone, I'm alone and I bring others and myself to God so as to shape the way in which I live in the world.
This is making me reflect on something else you shared with me recently, which is some thinking around sensory experiences of the gospel and touch. And I've been thinking a lot about the ways that touch is so present in Jesus's ministry. It's so fundamental to most of the miracles and just Jesus's way of being with people. I mean, that is the incarnation. God was in a body. God was with us. We spoke a little bit about Mary's anointing of Jesus and the significance of her kissing Jesus's feet. And as I've been reflecting on that, I've had moments of feeling disappointed of, well, why can't my relationship with Jesus include such physicality? And then I catch myself realizing that I don't think that God has intended to leave us bereft of relationship in these very concrete, very physical ways, simply because Jesus is no longer with us in the flesh in that sense. And this is where we need Eucharistic theology as well. But I think I have been reflecting a bit on, is this the role of the church in response to our problem of loneliness in the world as it's being named at large, to take seriously our responsibility to each other to be physically present, and not just as solution to our own individual loneliness, but as in living out the gospel?
That's a really great question. I like the way you pose it. And it seems to me that as physical beings, we are beings of senses. And all of our senses are also modalities of touch. Perhaps you might say a sight is not a modality of touch. That's a very distant, right? The rest of them seem to be forms of touch, some more intimate, others less. But even the sight also, it's really interesting. I was just reading recently, I've started reading Rilke's Book of Hours, his poems in German. I like to read them in German. I have a translation which I think is really lousy, and sometimes it helps me a little, but often doesn't. And in the very first poem, he says, "My seeing is ripe," and then he says, "And the things come to me as a bride." So in a sense, what I imagine here, that there's a relationship between the seeing self and the things one sees. But his seeing is as a ripe fruit, so that whatever he sees feels welcome to come to it, is invited to enjoy the sight with which they are being seen. And in that sense, it's the bride that comes to the one who sees, because it's affirmed and it sees the beauty in the seeing itself, right? So even in that activity of simply seeing, how do I see others? How do I see the other person when they pass me? They're not touched, they're not spoken to, they're just being seen. Even there, our sight can be ripe, so that it invites the other person, in a sense, to come to us, right? Or in a sense, to feel that they're welcome to come to us. And of course, that's true of other senses as well. And I think you're right to take us to the church as a site of where we encounter others in very much a material kind of a way. Now, senses is also where we can be very lonely. Yes. Where we can be very intimate and very lonely at the same time. So that they're very ambivalent kinds of things. We're at our best in our senses, and we're at our worst in our senses. And in that sense, I think senses require a really particular spirituality, and the fear of the senses, I think, was there because so much can go wrong. And hence they require disciplines. And what I mentioned earlier, what Bonhoeffer mentioned, often through senses that we transgress against the limit that the other presents.
Absolutely.
Make and remake the other into something that they're not and do not wish to be at all. So they're both a site where the communion and where overcoming of solitude happens in a very concrete way. Somebody's lonely, especially we have so many people who live alone, elderly people who live alone, who are probably never touched by somebody else. We go there, we spend time, we see, we smell, we talk. Sensuality is there in a kind of pure sense of sensuality is there, and they flower, they blossom, they open up. Because that's what that relationship does. At the same time, I was just, as you know, I'm steeped in Dostoevsky. And so I listen multiple times his great novels. And just recently I was listening to Crime and Punishment. And there is this one elderly woman. She is generally alone, but she is also pawnbroker. And that's the person that Raskolnikov kills. He comes and one easily becomes alone as she was, or she was hoping that she would be alone. One can become very easily prey to others' violence. And that violence can take so many different forms. And my sense is sometimes that our loneliness comes from the fear of being violated, of other people not respecting the limit. And one thing worse than being alone for many people is to be violated being in communion, being in the company of others. So that idea of respecting the limit and loving one who takes space and creates a limit for us, that in a sense ends up being a kind of a key to overcoming both solitude, loneliness of our own and loneliness of others. So, because when we attend to loneliness of others, in some ways we tend to our own loneliness. If we do it well, we discover ourselves afresh and anew and are nourished by the very food that we give others.
That's so rich. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, for the listener who is coming to this episode, perhaps sitting with their own feelings of loneliness, or who has had experiences of loneliness and presumably will have more experiences of loneliness to come, what are the questions you think we should be asking of those emotions?
That's way beyond my pay grade to answer this. I am, so I'll say what I often say when I'm asked a very concrete, practical question. I am a systematic theologian, which is to say, or constructive theologian, which is to say that I am impractical theologian. I have no idea how to answer these questions. We have addressed some of the questions already, but for me, do I dare to be alone? Mm-hmm. How do I practice pulling myself out, resisting the temptation to be immersed? Where do I draw strength when I feel lonely? Or how do I overcome the fear and extend a word, smile, touch to another person? We often, especially I think somehow in this socially connected age, physical kind of connection ends up being very difficult, and we're clumsy, we are unwilling, we feel that we are burden to each other rather than in some ways relieving their own loneliness. And we end up as those teenagers that I see every time I drive to work, waiting for a school bus. They've been there for 5 years on that same corner every single day, and they are saying nothing to each other. They're just looking at their phones, and there's no sense of some kind of connection between them. They're completely disconnected. So my sense would be questions that I ask myself are some such questions, or how do I become part of something larger in which I can contribute inversely? How do I avoid being swallowed by it? How do I find and root my sense of who I am before God, who has established me as a human being, and as a human being in communion? Questions are interminable for me, because this issue of being alone, being with others, and how does one be alone well with oneself, and how does one be well with others? These two questions are just about the fundamental questions of our lives. And how do I come to think that I don't need to give anything concrete to somebody to relieve their loneliness? How do I discover that by sheer having a loving attitude toward them, by them discovering that I honor, affirm, cherish them as they are, that's probably one of the most important things that I can do for another person. We're so utilitarian in what we think love is, and then miss the subtler, and I think in some ways more important ways of being there for other people.
Amen. That is not an impractical answer. Is there anything else on this subject that you feel like we missed?
In this area where importance of being alone, I have a phrase here that I didn't mention when I talked about it, nobody can be born in my place, nobody can die. I think behind it lies, nobody can be me instead of me.
Yes.
I must be me. And since I must be me to be me well, I need times with myself and getting to know me, working on myself, naming myself to myself, going through kind of narrating myself to myself, and seeing whether I recognize myself in my narration. So deeper knowledge of myself, deeper knowledge of the effects that I have on others, and what I do with the effects that I have on others. How do I manage them? How do I grow in relationship as myself, in relationship to others? For all of this, it seems to me that I need to be alone. I need solitude. I need to be freed from the noise, and then engage in the process of self-transformation, on transformation by the voice of God. My mother always was talking about when she prayed every morning. We all knew mom has to be left on her own, whether we were at home, summers especially when we didn't go to school. 8 o'clock, breakfast finished, everything, hour of prayer. She's alone. We have a very small apartment, so there was a room. She should not be disturbed, shouldn't be loud. She's there. And she cherished this very much. And then she told me that she has learned how to hear God speak. And she said there were hours and months and I didn't hear a thing. I didn't know anything. And it took me a while, almost like Samuel, hearing when God speaks, you hear and recognize God's voice. Right? That's how she thought about it. And the Samuel, the child, had to be taught by Eli. Is that an Eli? His superior there. So my mother said, I need to, over the years, I needed to learn how to hear God speak to me. And then she came to that point and could recognize, and then she would not leave before God. She had a sense God spoke to her. To her, those were precious times, because she, in those encounters, she was then back, in a sense, herself. She was there to face the day, to face naughty teenagers. My sister was good. I was a problem. And everything else. And my father was a minister, and the big minister's wife in a small community that we had. This was just terrible. Everybody was gossiping. Everybody was trying to, expecting something that you should do. And so it was a very difficult situation, wonderfully rich, in a sense, growing community. But that was an important part of for her being alone. Now, I can't do a thing like that. I don't know. This is so beautiful to me and so not me.
She learned how to listen to God in order to listen to you.
I know, and I benefit from that. And then I feel, why can't I do that? And why am I so deaf? Why am I so unable to pray well? So that's so when I'm alone, that those are my questions. Why am I so clumsy, God, before you?
Miroslav, thank you so much for your time on the podcast today. I'm grateful.
I'm delighted. I think this topic is really important, and I'm glad you're taking time to do a whole series on it.
I think a number of people will be touched by your thoughts. So thank you.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Miroslav Volf. Interview by Macie Bridge. Production assistance by Alexa Rollo, Emily Brookfield, and Hope Shun. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu and lifeworthliving.yale.edu, where you can find past episodes, articles, videos, books, and other educational resources that help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're new to the show, remember to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And if you've been listening for a while, consider this request. Share one of your favorite episodes, maybe it's this one, in your next conversation, whether it's with family, friends, coworkers, or online. As always, thanks for listening, friends. We'll be back with more soon.